So has anybody got any successes or particular failures, particularly in relation to planning for exit or thinking about planning for exit that yeah, we could briefly share, discuss if you wish to do so in open forum?
Well, for us, it's know your company, know what your own company does. I mean, really know it in detail, because loads of companies don't know what they do in detail, don't understand
Yeah.
their assets and value. And it's hard to do it. Being introspective is hard. So you need someone else to look at you, look at what you're doing, and tick off that you're in the right bailiwick, because it's so easy to be deluded.
No, I think that's a brilliant insight and a beautiful just a recap on what we've covered effectively. So there's two things to my mind really speak to that. Is number one, what we're going to cover today. So Daniel, who have been listening, will know exactly what I'm talking about in terms of know yourself better than you currently know yourself, or know your business better than you did previously. But clearly, the stuff we've already covered, certainly from a financial point of view. The how will a potential buyer look at your business from the financial due diligence point of view, which I think Mark covered back in week 4, I think it was, and also obviously last week when we covered the EVA valuation report. But I think that's a beautiful one. Anyway, I won't waffle on too much because I think Dan will talk to your particular point there, Lou. So thank you again for everybody for taking the time and effort to come. We're on the second half of the course at the moment, so we're well past the halfway mark. So just do a quick recap, just to check in as where we are. So Cliff started the session off in the first 2 sessions talking about what is planning for exit and how many things go into planning for exit, other than putting up a big for sale sign and then saying, that's how much it is, give me the money, off we go. Obviously a lot more complicated, and there's a lot of detail goes into how do you actually prepare your business for exit, how do you prepare yourself for exit, and the exit process itself is almost the one thing we haven't spoken too much about so far. Sanjay came in and gave us a real eye-opener in terms of the know your number. What number you need to have the security that you will never risk running out of money. And then Pradeep gave us a good insight into the pain potentially of not preparing yourself properly before exit. And there are some absolute horror stories in terms of very successful owners that have sold their business very successfully, and then life has been a disaster thereafter. It was in session 5 that we got hard-nosed on the financial, which is, if you like, coming back to the VFD Pro part of this, where we looked at the financial due diligence, which will actually be this is the way that a completely neutral, objective buyer is going to look at your business. Just assume that if everything is in good running working order, how much would I potentially be prepared to pay? And then obviously after that, they're going to start chipping the price down. So Neil came in and gave us a really good reminder of, again, this speaks to the point we were talking about earlier, know yourself, know what you look like to other people, de-risking the business, or more to the point, understanding what risks, or I do think for the risk dashboard, actually, it's got the wrong name, but it should be called opportunities. There's loads of opportunities that come out of going through a thorough audit of the business to identify not just risks, but areas where the business could be improved. Obviously, Mark then last week went through the educational piece around how our businesses are actually valued, and the process of putting a valuation together, and how that fits into the overall piece. So hopefully let's move on now. I'm going to hand over to someone I've known for a long time, Daniel Plowright. Dan's an expert on engagement, customer engagement, client engagement. And if you ever want to know what people really think about your business, the only people that really matter, until you're trying to sell it, in which case the buyer will come into play, but it's the people that really matter is clearly the employees and the customers. But from a financial point of view and selling the business, it's primarily the customers, because that's where all the money comes from. So I think with no further ado, Dan, are you happy to take over from there? I think you should.
Yeah. Hopefully everyone can see my screen okay.
Brilliant.
Thumbs up. Yeah. I was sitting on. Thanks for the intro, Steve. Good to see you all. Quite a lot of you I know or I've met. Nice to see Nigel. As I say, from my point of view, I sat in on last week's session, and Cliff kind of, when he introduced this, I seem to remember, said it was about, it's headlined as growth, but then it was kind of nuanced to growth, efficient growth. And that's kind of, I suppose, really where I'm coming from with this. I always say that kind of beginning of my presentations, a lot of this stuff isn't rocket science, which sounds a bit glib, but at the end of the day, I think hopefully this will be either for yourselves or for businesses that you're connected to or supporting, maybe just prompt a few bullet points at the end that says, actually, yeah, we know we should be doing this stuff, but we're not, or we're not doing it as efficiently, or we've slightly lost direction a little bit on terms of some of our activity. So what I'm going to do is just kind of walk through, I think, kind of 2 or 3 ways that businesses can efficiently grow. And then as we get to the end of the presentation, talk through kind of some of the material and support that's available to kind of move from just trying to grind out the numbers to actually doing something about it. So if I can get this up and running. So yeah, growth, and then I subtitled how to grow efficiently. We're starting off by, I'm doing quite a bit of work on the kind of peer networks program with Bays at the moment, and we did a quick survey of kind of some of the key challenges that those businesses were facing. So I'm not saying that this is particularly robust data, but it kind of seems to stand out. And clearly, we've all got different kind of drivers going on in terms of what's going on, supply chains and all sorts of things at the moment. But basically, of the people we asked, the vast majority saw sales and marketing as a critical challenge. They were given a list, but yeah, quite the vast majority chose this particular area. So I would say, near on 100% have got an issue here. And the trouble is, we talk about growth, and that suggests that everybody wants to kind of get bigger and bigger, but often it's referring to the fact that I just want to do what I do more efficiently, or I want to make more money out of it. So I'm not necessarily assuming that businesses are kind of aspirationally trying to double their size, although many are. But ultimately, it's how can we grow efficiently, make more profit, and all the kind of good things that sit behind it. Now, when you go looking at, I want to grow and therefore I want to do some marketing, tends to be a kind of logical thought process. You end up, you Google marketing, you get nice pictures like this. Everything's on target. And as Moose mentioned earlier on, often we don't know, the businesses don't know kind of where they're at and what they're doing. And so this this highly targeted marketing activity is somehow going adrift quite significantly, which is something I'm going to touch on in a second. And yeah, all of this assumes that the business understands, again, which was mentioned in the kind of preamble that we had at the beginning, assumes the business knows what it's doing, is really quite clear on its messaging, is really quite clear on its targeting, knows who it wants to talk to, knows where they are, can find them easily, is having a dialogue, and has a really efficient supply chain and engagement process. That means that everything's lovely. I think the reality is that a lot in many of the cases that we deal with, or that we have engagement discussions on, this isn't in place, because I'll come back to some of the feedback work that we do. And as Steve mentioned at the beginning, quite a lot of our work is we are having dialogue with businesses, clients on their behalf as an independent third party to gauge the strength of that relationship in terms of what's working well, what's not working quite so well, how could that relationship be improved, and in a nutshell, what would make that customer stick around longer, spend more money on more things, and potentially make some sensible and worthwhile introductions. It's kind of where we're trying to come from. And the issue for us is a lot of the time that the businesses don't have any of this stuff in place. So whilst it looks lovely, they end up something looking like this. Well, in this particular example, nothing's on target. Some of the stuff will land, this kind of pure, if you like, outbound marketing activity through whichever channel they choose to use. But a lot of it just misses the plot completely. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm looking at how we leverage those relationships with the existing customer base, whether it's customers that the business has got at the moment, or it's customers that they've had a historic relationship with. And we can all start to get quite technical and go back to our textbooks and say, let's look at some matrices or matrices. And whether it's the Boston Consulting Matrix or Ansoff's Matrix, you end up looking at something like this, which is, okay, I've got 4 areas that I could probably potentially target. Well, to my mind, if we keep it simple, we're going to sell more of the same product to the same people. We're going to sell new product to the same people. Okay, was that new product we already have, or is this something brand new? So there's not really nuanced within these type of models as to where we go. Are we going to sell the same product to new markets, new customers? And clearly my color coding on here is kind of indicating that some of this gets a lot more difficult. And ultimately, yeah, I appreciate, yeah, I'm saying that all marketing is misdirected, and I appreciate that's not the case, because, you know, people spend an awful lot of money on this stuff, and sometimes it does land, but often for the kind of small to medium sized businesses, they're doing an awful lot of stuff that is not going anywhere. So I would suggest that the kind of new products to new markets is unpredictable. That's all also unpredictable, potentially, in terms of its outcome. But when you look at the other areas, we've got this whole stretch here in terms of the existing client base, in terms of customer retention, attrition, all that kind of stuff that kicks in. Got a whole opportunity here around gap selling, whether that's upselling, cross-selling, frequency of purchase, size of purchase, all the sorts of things that we've talked about on this program and other programs that we run. And then we've got this whole opportunity here potentially with referrals. So the kind of, those are the three areas that kind of, I guess, interest me in terms of where businesses can be really quite efficient, and there's lots of, I suppose, hidden opportunities there for a business to grow if it wants to grow, or to replace low margin business quite efficiently by having these types of conversations. And often the first kind of questions I'm asking is, as a business, do you resource? And by that I mean, are you physically doing it yourself? Are you spending money with some other third party, depending on your size? Are you spending time, effort, and cash on marketing activities? And if they say yes, it's like, well, what's your ROI on that? And often they find it difficult. They don't have an answer, or they find it difficult to answer, or the answer is kind of incomplete. And that's something we're going to touch on, as I say, towards the end of this, in terms of it is possible to assess that ROI. And it's down to how accurate kind of the figures are within the accounts, etc. But we've seen the evidence of it, and it's possible to do it. The other thing for me is, do you as a business have a sales target? Do you have a forecast? Do you have a plan, budget, whatever you choose to call it? And it's like, well, no, I don't. Well, okay, well, how are you tracking the results? So again, we've got this whole conversation that tends to go on with the business, where they're, in other presentations, I talk about this whole concept of kind of there's a bucket of value there, and it's leaking because they're not really sure where to kind of look and where to focus. So if they're kind of wandering around in the dark potentially without any sales targets, then how do we know what these kind of growth initiatives that we've got in place, what are they actually supposed to be trying to achieve? Because you talk to, if we were stood there talking to a group of businesses and having an interactive conversation as well, you get some really quite variable answers. And I appreciate that, again, depending on the size of the business, depending on the market they're in, that whether they're product or service driven, etc., will have a difference in terms of how this kind of plays out. Because clearly some businesses are very reliant on, significantly 1, 2, or 3 large customers, whereas others are kind of selling a lot of stuff to many people. But I think the important thing for me is they've got to start somewhere with some figures. And this, I appreciate, I'm kind of apologize that this is a really simplistic example, but I like to try and keep things simple so that we can actually go and do some stuff with it. So again, this is from evidence of, when we were doing kind of face-to-face sessions pre-COVID, which is an awful long time ago now, where you'd have this discussion with businesses of, I would say, of a reasonable size with a headcount in there, and they still are not having a monthly forecast. And going back to the whole purpose of this kind of activity in terms of sale and exit, these are the sorts of things that need to be built. And as Cliff has alluded to previously, they need to be built up, and you've got to be able to show some history against it. So the simple example I use is, here is a business with a monthly forecast, and ultimately it probably does have a level of revenue without them having to do much. They've got some sort of recurring revenue stream in place, whatever that might be. They have a true recurring revenue model, such as web hosting or some sort of service related contract, or they can see some sort of regular income coming through, but they've got a gap that they need to find, and it's that gap that I'm kind of interested in, or I think we should be interested in. So if you kind of annualize that, it's like, well, okay, I'm looking at my projections for next year. I'm hoping to hit 100. I expect I'm going to hit 70. So I've got to find this gap of 30. And that's where my marketing kicks in. So now my marketing's focused on this gap of 30. My marketing, business development, whatever the right words are, sales and marketing, whatever the right words are for your particular type of business organization. Okay, so let's start with our base of 70. Well, is it really a base of 70? Because there's a couple of things that are going to impact this. And this used to say COVID, but now other things come into play. Who would have thought what's happening at the moment would have been happening 2 months ago? So there's attrition that happens in a business, which I'm going to talk about, which is stuff that the business I think can control. They can control some of the client loss or customer loss that they have. but there's probably attrition that's caused by external factors that are broadly out of their control. And up till fairly recently, it said COVID, but there are other things that come into play. So we're having this conversation with a business owner and their marketing team or the sales team and saying, well, you've started at this point, but the reality is that your base point is probably a little bit lower. And obviously this is a made up example, but it's a bit lower than where you think. And is that your reality? So kind of get your head around that. So now we want to start building up to our kind of theoretical target of 100. Well, there's a number of things we can do. Is what can we do as a retention strategy, which Steve mentioned at the beginning, to try and offset some of that loss as a start point, to negate it potentially completely? What can we do around upsell and cross-sell? What can we do around frequency and transaction value, even just with the existing client base? And then we've got this whole opportunity around referrals. So once we've built that back up, now on the far right, we're saying, okay, this is the bit that our, if you like, our new marketing or our new prospecting or people we just don't know, talking to strangers, whatever we kind of classify that as, that's the work that's got to do. And often if you calculate it like this and say, well, look, for all of that marketing spend that's gone into or business development spend that's gone in, it's only attributed to that piece potentially, and it looks quite expensive, or potentially can look quite expensive. So we're kind of looking, in my mind, we're looking at these three areas as a start point for kind of kickstarting the business going forward. Now, clearly, I'm biasing this presentation towards that, but ultimately this does need to be done in balance with any kind of marketing activity that the business needs to do. But my point here is it's got to have a target. Otherwise, why are we doing half of this stuff? And often the conversations that we have is, yes, you're paying this third party for this type of initiative, this type of activity, and it doesn't really matter what the number is. What are you getting in return for that spend? And they often don't know. And the classic example, for those of you that remember, was the Yellow Pages. I remember talking to accountancy practices. Yeah, we are spending £7,000 a year on Yellow Pages. Okay, why? Because everybody else is doing it. What return are you getting? I don't know. And yeah, other things have subsequently taken over. Like, someone even mentioned to me, I had a client not that long ago. For those of you that remember Applegate, Applegate was a directory that came along kind of following Yellow, spending £2,000 a year, even 2 years ago on this. Like, why are you doing it? Well, because we've always done it. And if we don't do it, then something disastrous might happen. The benefit you've now got, obviously, with those types of initiatives is you can switch stuff off and you can switch it back on really quite easily. It's not like I've got to be in this publication. With the online stuff, it's so much easier to kind of do the test and measure. So 3 quick wins for every business is kind of what I'm going to cover off in my mind, which is stop losing customers. I'm going to talk about this attrition rate, conduct a broad gap analysis, and follow up on introductions. And I'll kind of explain in a bit more detail where I'm bringing these percentages from. So client retention, 20%. 20% is the figure that was quoted, still is quoted as the average client loss for an average business. And it has to be an average of an average. So is that saying that, again, if you have businesses there, they'll say, don't agree, do agree, seems high, seems low. It's a number. Does that mean that we're replacing our client bank every 5 years because we're losing 20% per year? No, it probably means there's an awful lot. There's probably a core stable client customer base and a significant amount of churn, expensive churn at the top. So one is for a business, have you a handle on this figure? Whether it's 5%, 25%, whatever, but there is a number there when you kind of get into it. Okay. Then we start to explore on kind of why these relationships are breaking down and what's the big reason customers leave. And the biggest reason that customers leave is people fall out of love with each other. The customer thinks the supplier doesn't care. They're slightly tempted by some other offer somewhere else. Something comes along and it just causes them to flip. And then it's a question of, well, how easy is it for them to move? Because if it's relatively easy for them to move, then they'll probably go. Yeah, we've all got situations where we want to be out of contract on something, but it's just there's so many barriers in place, we kind of put up with it. The other big number, which is where the kind of combined 82% or 80-odd% comes from, is a service issue. So the perception of some unresolved service issue. So there's 80-odd%, I would say, of the reasons that the relationships break down has some degree of control from the supplying company, because they should have been able to potentially foresee some of this and do something about it. Yes, things like price are important, But again, the larger the businesses typically have a larger sales and marketing team, which means that we have more excuses around, well, we lost that deal or we didn't get that deal because of price. But price only equates to around about 9 or 10% on average. And it's understanding these issues. These are the issues. And it goes right back to the very beginning. If your sales argument's not good enough or strong enough because you don't really know what problem you're solving for the business, then yeah, you are trading a commodity and you're going to be trading on price. And that's the wrong place to be in most cases. Then we touch on, as Steve alluded to at the beginning, it's about customer satisfaction. So if it's likely I'm going to lose some people, who am I going to lose and when are they going to go? I hope that the ones I lose are the ones I wanted to lose potentially. But if I don't know that, it could be that I'm losing my most profitable clients. And again, we've seen examples, and I'm sure you've maybe had examples of it yourself or businesses that you work with. You go, oh, I wasn't expecting that to happen. That's caused me a problem. Some of it is potentially out of our control. Big client gets bought by another big client. They have a preferred supplier. It's not you. That's just unlucky. But a lot of this can be foreseen. And I think the issue you've got where businesses say, well, I've got a handle on my client satisfaction because I conduct a survey or whatever it is that I might do. That's fantastic that they actually do it. That's great. But the issue is that you have what they call this silent majority, the people that tend to respond to, for example, online surveys. The average response rate on an online survey is around about 30%. And what you've got is this bell curve, which I'll show you in a second, which is, the extremes tend to respond. We have those that think you're great respond, those that think you're awful respond. You then average that together and go, well, that's my average client satisfaction rating. And the issue is you've got this huge group in the middle, which is they call the silent majority, who, those of us that don't respond to surveys. I think you're doing all right, but I can't be bothered to fill this form out to tell you that. I don't think you're doing all right, but I'm not sufficiently motivated to spend another 5 minutes telling you why. So businesses make decisions based on the extremes of this, typically. There's all sorts of examples I could show you, but ultimately, if you kind of think about your iceberg analogy, we've got some visibility on either end of this, but there's this huge group in the middle that we just don't know what they think. And often businesses are making quite big decisions based on aggregated data from either end of this type of bell curve, which I think is an issue for them, potentially. And ultimately, you kind of go down that loop of, what might that silent majority say? Well, they might be saying something like this. So, here's a typical example. The supplier comes in and says, ultimately, is everything okay? The client comes back with, yeah, everything's okay, thank you. But the reality of the situation is, if it was prompted, everything is not okay. We've all been in this situation because we don't want to cause a fuss, or it's not in our personal nature, or whatever it might be, that we just think, do you know what, I'm not going to kick off on this particular issue because I just don't think they're going to resolve it. I haven't got the will to do it. I'm going to move on and think about something else. And eventually that will cause a breakdown of that relationship. And it might be that relationship takes a long time to break down, or it could happen quite quickly, depending on what the kind of cost and issues around switching supply might be. So then it comes into, is there a way of doing this in such a way that I can get some more impartial responses such that I'm getting a better data set that I can make a more informed management decision against? Because ultimately, depending on how you score your data or your feedback, whether it's on a 5 or 10 point scale, and this is from quite a large data set, the customer satisfaction index that's done annually, is, well, this isn't a surprise, is it? If I score you 5 out of 5, then yes, I'm likely to stay and I'm likely to recommend you. Well, fair enough. Thanks for that, Dan. That was really insightful. The key thing for me is that when that score drops down, these figures drop off markedly. So if you think about, for those of you that potentially are aware or have used Net Promoter Score, if I move from a 9 and 10 out of 10 to a 7 and 8 out of 10, my propensity to stick around and recommend have just dropped off. Arguably, they've dropped off a cliff. So it comes back down to the sense of some businesses are, I think, very much rose tinted in terms of when they're looking at their information and everything's right. And then a month later, a client leaves. And they go, well, we weren't expecting that because that's not in our data. We thought everything was great. Because we don't necessarily go looking for problems because we don't want to be dealing with them, potentially. And this is just to give you a really simple example of a data set, is that, here is, and I'll do the reveal, but we've asked some customers what they think, and on average they've scored us 4 out of 5. So what would we do with that? that everything seems fine. Well, the reality is that there's a spread. So we've got some customers who are scoring us lower than others. Okay. And there's a story. There'll be a story behind all of these. It might be that the client is number one is an absolute nightmare, and we don't want to do business with them anymore. Or it might be that they're our most profitable customer, and we go, oh, we have a problem. If you start to break it down, we've got most of them would recommend, what can we do with that information? And then we start asking questions and scores around, what's the delivery like? What's the perception of value? Or how helpful is this supplier or in this relationship? And what's the quality of the communication? And we get a breakdown there. And all of a sudden, from an average of 4, there's a huge amount of information, I would say here, that could be acted on just on these 5 customers as a very, very small data set. And obviously, the more data we've got, the more you can do with it. But again, this is a concern that I think we have and businesses should have, is that they're often looking at that bottom right-hand corner and going, that's okay, we move on and do something else. And there's a huge amount of stuff that can come out of this in terms of the positive stories, the recommendations, the referrals, the addressing the problems. All these bits and pieces can come through. So it's about the information and what we do with it. And these are the reasons that there are many, but ultimately the reasons that customers don't buy more stuff, products, services, is often can be aggregated under expectations are not being managed. There'll be all sorts of reasons that are nuanced for that particular customer supplier relationship, and by sector it might be slightly different, but it goes back to the chart. They're annoyed or irritated about something. Typically, I'm not saying the customer's always right, because often they're not, but it's just that their expectations, their current reality hasn't been managed well enough, and it just breaks down. And it comes back to the adage of, what does it cost you as a business to acquire onboard a new customer versus looking after and maintaining an existing one? And there's a ratio, whether it's 10 to 1, 7 to 1, 5 to 1, but there's a number. And typically that new client acquisition comes at a cost, certainly over the first couple of years or so. So again, it's just, do we understand this as a business in terms of why those expectations are not being managed and what we can do about it? So that's that first bit around retention, retention and customer attrition. If we then look at gap analysis, and from that point of view, it's things like, what are we selling? And this is kind of the concept. We're selling coffee. Well, are we selling cheap? Are we selling premium? Where is the potential here for an upsell? Where's the potential for a cross-sell? So what market are we in? Going right the way back to the beginning, what problem we're solving? Do we understand the variety of the customers that we've got? Do we know what they actually need? Have we asked them that question? How have we understood that data, and how have we interpreted that information in terms of all these opportunities that come through that potentially could be of significant value and could be a really, really easy and efficient sale, growth opportunity, whatever you want to call it, for that particular organization? And I think you touch on stories around how often should customers buy, how much should they spend when they're in there, how does that benchmark against industry average? This is a conversation that we have with a stationery company. We've got 850 customers. Brilliant. If you think about exit planning here, if this guy was about to exit, and it's a genuine conversation, I'd be crying by the end of this. We've got 850 customers. So a comment from us, would quarterly seem to be a reasonable purchase frequency? Yes, it would. Right, well, on that information, you've got 250 customers. So we've got business here that in the space of 5 minutes conversation from their own data has gone from, I think we're great and we've got 850 regular recurring repeat customers that is of value if I'm looking to sell this business, to based on this one metric, which no one's arguing about, it's a lot less. And that's a very different story that's now being told between these parties. Whatever the story is, whether it's about business sale and exit, or whether it's about investment, or whatever it might be. And this is applicable to every business, really, in terms of what that purchase frequency might and should be for that particular type of organization. So we can talk about customer segmentation, we can talk about product segmentation, we can talk about channel segment. There's all these things that can be segmented. And I think for businesses of a certain size that don't have these kind of behemoth, marketing, sales teams, branding departments, it's being sensible about what's appropriate. And just as an amusing aside, latest stat that I found on the Colgate website, how many different varieties of toothpaste do they sell? 49. Right. there's some serious segmentation gone on there, and we can look at various markets and understand, has that gone too far? Possibly. Are they all profitable? Probably not. It's about what's sensible for a particular business. And again, you'll see this as you work it through, but again, it's really simple. There's some customers here and we have some products and services. Now, I tend to use the phrase product and service interchangeably because some businesses might sell products and some might sell services. But I think we have to be careful about that as well, because yeah, we see situations where the business has gone in and sold its product. And a classic example I can remember is a business went in and sold its product, which was alarm systems, smoke detectors, the installation of this equipment. But they weren't doing the annual servicing, which is a legal compliance requirement. They did do annual servicing, but not for that customer, because that customer was getting it done by somebody else. Why? Because they'd never asked. It never came up on the customer checklist conversation. So it's a question when we're talking about products and services. Many businesses that sell a product do sell a service on top of that, and they fail to sell it very successfully because they're almost seen as two separate things. So again, keeping things really simple, because businesses will say, well, what do you mean by gap analysis? Well, we've got some customers and we've got some products and services that we sell, and we know what we're selling to who at the moment. We must know that because that's got to be in our numbers somewhere. We then might have a look at that and say, okay, customer number one is not going to buy any more of it. We have maxed out. We've had the conversation. They're just not going to buy any more of this stuff. That's fine. Okay, so we've now identified a whole bunch of opportunities here. And that's where my 30% figure comes from, because that I showed earlier on, because I feel just anecdotally from the conversations that we have, when you actually start to look at this analysis, there is 20, 25, or even up to 40% potential on the table just from this conversation. Obviously, if the business is of a reasonable size and they've got a reasonable size client base and a range of products. But I think the key thing is not all the opportunities are equal, because, and that's again the danger that the business, oh, well, okay, sales team, off you go and fill all these gaps up for us. Because the reality will be that we might look at this and go, okay, customer number 6 is really quite painful. They're low margin. They're on a bad deal. As far as we're concerned, we really don't want to sell anything more to them. Or it could be that product number 4 is historically low margin, and actually we don't want to sell any more of that product, or we're withdrawing from it. So it's again about the nuances of this. And okay, whilst this is a rudimentary example of that, what I'll show you towards the end of the presentation is something slightly more nuanced, that will move this conversation forward. Because often we'll have a dialogue that says, okay, we've got feedback from your customers that they think you're brilliant, and you've sold them one of your 5 services, and their feedback to us is they think you're brilliant, and there is nothing more than you can do to help them. And frankly, I don't believe that in most cases, because the reason they think that you can't do anything else to help them is because you've not taken the time to fully explore all the things you do with them and those things that might be of benefit to them. If they think you're brilliant, there's a fair chance you can get in and have that conversation. Yeah, but we put it on our emails and we put it on our newsletter and it's all on our website, if it is. Yeah, but as an existing customer, I would suggest it's less likely they're going to read some of that stuff. You need to find a way of having that dialogue that's appropriate to that particular organization. So moving on to referrals, I think the key thing, and I kind of alluded to it, is that, yeah, this is a really old kind of statistic, but ultimately we see this is that we'll go in and do a survey, a client engagement survey with somebody, and we'll go back to the business and say, look, 80, 90, near on 100% of your customers, even the ones that aren't scoring you 100%, are actually saying they would recommend you or they would refer you. What process have you got in place to actually do something with that information? And they don't have one, because they're too busy kind of chasing brand new sales. It's like, look, there's people here that, you know, you want more of these because these are the current customers you've got, probably in most cases. And whether it's they don't know how to ask, they don't want to ask, the timing's never right, they don't have the right script, they don't have whatever it is, there's always an excuse for not doing it. And often this is potentially the easiest piece of new business you can pick up. And I think this is the referral. Yeah, this is the referral challenge, is that unless whether I'm a customer or one of your network colleagues or whatever it might be, unless I know the answers to these questions, then ultimately, I'm going to really struggle to give you something sensible. So an existing customer knows what you've done for them to solve a particular problem. You're going to go and talk to them about solving more of their problems because they think you're generally a good chap and all of that kind of good stuff. They must know other people within their industry or within their kind of working environment that have a similar problem that needs to be solved. And it's that bit that businesses sometimes fail to kind of explore, I would suggest. I just think there is money left on the table off the back of this. And I think the whole thing coming through from here is that, okay, if I'm going to do all of this, then it goes right back to what we were saying at the beginning in terms of, can I evidence that I know what I'm doing? I'm a good supplier, I'm a reliable supplier. I'm right. I'm the right fit, and it's all about this whole concept of where's the influence sit, and this kind of what they kind of badge this under social proof, which is, are we clear on our proposition? Do we know what problem we're solving and for who? Because often, if you go to someone's website, which is obviously the equivalent of their brochure, then it really isn't clear. If you take all the pictures off it, and often the pictures don't help either, but if you just read the text, it's like it doesn't make it clear at all who you're looking to service and who you're looking to help. It's all about what we do, and we've got a lovely office and we do something really quite technical, but it's not talking about the problem. All these sorts of things are things that need to come into play to demonstrate to somebody, whether that's an existing customer and you're moving into a new service area with them, or you're looking to make a referral into somebody. The referral gets you part way down that process, but they will want to check the kind of credibility just to make sure everything is as it should be. And these are all areas that a business can assess itself against. It can assess itself versus the competition to find out kind of where they feel that they sit by comparison, because this is kind of such a moving feast. Websites never finished, all of that kind of stuff. But it's possible to take a view on where you are versus your competition and say, look, honestly, as a new customer or an existing customer buying a new product, whatever it might be, do I think we stack up? Are we telling the best possible message or getting across the best possible message that we can? So just talk about improving business performance in terms of potential process. This is kind of the flow that we would suggest businesses tend to have a look at, is that, and it kind of captures everything we just talked about, which is, as the business leader, let's say, I've got a whole bunch of stuff I'm trying to juggle. And let's say I'm going to use the word grow, but as I say, that could mean I'm just trying to replace, more profitable sales, whatever it might be, but I'm looking to grow. So I do that by investing in some stuff. And that stuff could be people, my first sales director, or I'm making my team bigger, or I buy into newsletters, I buy into a website, I take on a social media company, I buy into PR, so whatever it might be, there's some stuff that happens. And by that, I mean, I'm either spending my own time doing it or I'm paying somebody else to do it, which is the same thing. But then they realize they bought this kind of mechanic to kind of do some things, and they don't have the kind of material or fuel to feed it. And therefore it's like, well, okay, I've now got this kind of cost heavy resource, but my messaging is not quite right because I'm not really sure where it helps. So what's really happening is I've got the cost of all this stuff and I'm not getting the return I should. I am getting some leads from it because it is connecting with some people, going back to my arrow analogy, it's hitting some people. And my conversion is not as strong as it could be because my sales messaging is not compelling. My evidence isn't as compelling as it could be. You've kind of got me interested, but I'm now not convinced. So what we're suggesting is that, by going through a process of engagement, however that's done, bearing in mind there are some pitfalls with just kind of doing stuff remotely, a business should be able to establish who's on the positive side and who's on the negative side. So ultimately, for those that are kind of more positively inclined, we should be able to get some positive feedback. We should then be able to potentially build that into a case study and then start to build our evidence pot up. And ultimately, if you start to look at that pie now, I've got, well, okay, my leads are going to improve because I've got my messaging better. My conversion is going to improve because my evidence is better. I've actually engaged with an existing customer, which means my cross-sell is going to improve. Yeah, I've got the opportunity there for cross-sell and upsell. I've also got the opportunity, because I know they're happy to ask for referrals. okay, so what about this last piece? Okay, well, this chap that's not looking very happy at the bottom, can I do something to kind of, at least not, he might not be ecstatic, might never be ecstatic, but can I keep hold of him for a bit longer? Can I improve his mood? And there are potentially a number of ways that could be done. So ultimately, where you end up with that bit is that kind of retention part of the pie starts to build up, which goes right the way back to the graph we were showing at the beginning. So ultimately, there is a way here that I think before this all helps with everything in terms of, you know, looking after the existing customers, keeping hold of them, and then acquiring new customers as well. So in terms of generating the greatest return back and keeping things simple, yeah, I do think there's 4 chunks to this, which is, can we reactivate those past customers or those that we have identified might soon be leaving us? Can we re-engage in some way? Can we do something about this retention piece in terms of cross-sell, upsell, frequency, transaction value, lifetime value, all of that kind of stuff? We know referred business is better business typically. So what can we do to improve our kind of referral process? And then on this sales funnel prospecting on the unknown, it's like, okay, how can we make that as efficient as possible? And ultimately what the business has got to decide is where does it want to spend its time and effort? It might spread it equally across all 3, but my concern for a lot of businesses is that they just go to the right hand side of this. They go, right, that's where we're focusing our effort. Oh, hang on a minute. What's happened to these customers that we thought were loyal? They're all starting to disappear out the door. And obviously, depending on the size of the business, it might take a while for them to notice if they're not kind of measuring it. So those are the 3 wins that I think are there for practically every business if they can kind of get their minds around it. And then the question for me is, well, how do we even start the process of acting on this stuff? And this, you know, I just wanted to feed this back to some of the reporting that's available through, you know, some of the other things that you talked about in previous sessions, because there's a whole bunch of reporting that comes out of, for example, the VFD, which touches on all of this, because often we'll have a conversation with somebody and they'll go, okay, right, well, as a result of this, we're going to now do some analysis, and we've now got this really horrendous looking spreadsheet that no one really understands, and we're going to use that to identify our gaps or whatever it might be. So just really quickly, it's going, right, so we've got a whole bunch of reports that give you an indication of where things are at. That's great. We've got a customer analysis report that highlights where the challenges and opportunities might be in terms of retention and attrition. We've got a marketing ROI report, which shows what, again, on the assumption that the financial information is adequately coded, gives you a steer on whether we're getting a return on marketing. So that's fine. That's good. We've got the business growth model where we can have a tweak of things like transaction values, retention rates, etc., which starts to demonstrate what if could look like. So we know what the current rates are. We know if we move them forward, what that might look like going forward. This is quite a big one, which is this segmentation and customer targeting, which is typically when we say to a business at the end of an activity, right, I want you to go and have a look and do that gap analysis. And they go, where do I start? Well, this is a really good start point for that, because they can tweak something like this, either from that system or whatever system they're using, to identify the opportunities. So what we're trying to encourage, or I'm trying to encourage businesses to do, is to say, you can tie yourselves up in knots with this analysis, but we need to get to the numbers as quickly as we possibly can, such that we can spend our time doing something about it rather than disappearing in a black hole. And then we've got the customer exception report, which is flagging. It obviously gets flagged if we think there's an issue where we're losing more customers than we're gaining. So there's a whole bunch of tools just on this particular platform that can help with that. And clearly there's other stuff available, and businesses will have their own spreadsheets, but I just think there's no excuse really for not being able to address some of these opportunities. Yeah, even from our point of view, we've got one which is really simple in terms of helping the business identify where their opportunity might be from just following some kind of simple steps. So I think from my point of view, before I hand back over to Steve and Claire for your closing thoughts, really, the business has got to have a target and forecast. Otherwise, how does it understand or measure anything in relation to the activities it's undertaking? That obviously leads into a KPI and scorecard, which has to be relevant to that particular organization. It needs to find a way of identifying any business that's at risk. So that attrition piece, it needs to conduct that gap analysis. But But ultimately, it's got to refine the marketing message based off the stories it's getting back from its customers. And so, well, this is why we're buying from you, because we think you're great because of these reasons, not the reasons the business thinks it's buying the product, because often they're quite different. So this whole piece, just go and talk to some customers. However it's done, talk to some customers and just see what they're saying. And that will unlock, I think, an awful lot of everything that we've just spoken about. Steve, I'm going to hand back over to you. Thank you.